Welcome to the second episode of the Progress Profile Alzheimer's Research in Focus. Today, we are joined by Dr. Phyllis Ferrell, MBA, innovator, investor, and incubator for brain health and longevity. In this episode, Dr. Ferrell joins Dr. Harrison to examine why scientific progress alone isn't enough to transform dementia care. Their conversation explores the persistent stigma surrounding cognitive impairment, the importance of timely and accurate diagnosis, and the policy and infrastructure changes needed to make early detection accessible to everyone. They also discuss the growing recognition of sex differences in brain health, opportunities to improve clinical trial participation, and how lessons learned in Alzheimer's disease can help advanced care and research for other neurodegenerative conditions. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Harrison.
Emma, thank you so much for that. And Phyllis, oh my gosh, this is such a joy to have you here today. Thank you so much for turning out for us. How are you?
Hi, John. It's so nice to see you. I just wish it was in three dimensions. So thanks for having me.
Well, we'll fix that soon enough, Phyllis. But no, thank you in the meantime. I've been longing to do this with you. So it's really good that we've managed to get in the same place at the same time. Because there's so much to talk about, Phyllis. So without any hanging around, if it's okay by you, I'm just going to jump straight in. Does that work for
Let's
you?
let's go. Sure.
Outstanding. I'm just gonna sort of bluff you up a little bit here. So you're very, very privileged role, Phyllis, because you very much sit in the intersection of so much of the activity that we're engaged in, both collectively but also the community level. And you have this wonderful kind of top-down view on what people are thinking, what people are doing, and I think most interestingly for me in the audience, probably what people are going to think about doing next, which is really where the action is. So I'm going to focus very much on the intersection of policy and advocacy and public health in the Alzheimer's disease space, just to orient our audience and also to give you some parameters to work with. So that's what I'd like to kick off with. And the one thing I really want to start with, because I know this has been an issue for you for a little while now. What are the biggest misconceptions or stigmas around Alzheimer's disease? And does it go beyond just detection? Is it something that people have to live with for the duration of the disorder?
Well, it's such a great question, John. You and I would be having this conversation if we were in the hallway of one of our scientific conferences. So it's fun to be able to do this with you. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen, so I've been at this now for about 15 years, is we have this amazing Alzheimer's community. It's tight knit, it's collaborative, it's incredibly supportive, and we've been making a ton of progress. But that progress has really kind of been in our own bubble, right? And if you think about it, up until the approvals of lecanemab and donanemab, we really hadn't had anything new happen in Alzheimer's disease in over 30 years. And so what we have is we have this massive disconnect between the people who are doing the science, understanding the science, following the science, and the people who are actually seeing the majority of patients. And there hasn't been a lot of stuff coming out of the research community that really changed practice at the bedside. And so as a result, we've got this group of us that are, just heroically excited about the progress we've made scientifically, and yet a whole bunch of people who, whether that be the patients and their families and their caregivers or the doctors that care for them, that really don't have an appreciation of how much progress we've made. And there's little things, John. Like one of the things that really makes me crazy is that we use the words Alzheimer's and dementia interchangeably. Those are not interchangeable words, but we use them, and that's sloppy. That's sloppy language that we use in the lay community, but also in the medical community. And now we know that dementia is on the spectrum of cognitive impairment, but there could be multiple causes of dementia. And what we know is around the pathology of Alzheimer's, all the progress we've made, that we really now can identify that disease much, much earlier. And we've got to clean up some of that language, because I think when we do, we're going to reduce the stigma. The word dementia is a horribly stigmatized word. And people need to understand that there is a path forward for us in this generation where you can live and thrive with Alzheimer's. if you catch it early and can do something about it. And that's because of the research coming and it's because of the progress we've made. And so those are a few of the things that I see as real opportunities for us as we transition from our scientific environment to our more public and public health environment.
Phyllis, thank you so much, and wonderful place to start. And that care around terms and term specificity, completely agree. For too long, I think it's been too woolly. And one of the great revelations for me when I get shipped out by my wife to a dinner party locally, which is typically full of reasonably well educated, intelligent people, often very well educated, intelligent people, and it's always a shock for me to discover just how little even those kinds of folk really know about Alzheimer's disease, dementia, the kinds of things that you quite rightly say, we'd talk about over a water cooler in a corridor routinely and have almost a complete understanding of one another's terms. So I like that idea that greater specificity, getting people closer to the idea of what we mean by a disease process and what that looks like. And I think that for me has always been the distinction. So you can have dementia for a number of reasons, but there are very specific diseases that we know now have probably some very clear precipitants that we can potentially tackle as well. So thank you for starting there. That's an incredibly helpful place to start. And if I think about the term dementia and the variants that get caught up in that broad category, so we talked a little bit about Alzheimer's disease, but I'm mindful also that there's a good deal of interest in Parkinson's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal dementia, a whole variety of dementias. Do you think we're quite as far on with those, or we've still got a little way to go by comparison, for example, general understanding of Alzheimer's disease?
No, I think we have progress to make on all of them, to be fair. And I think, sometimes we get chastised a little bit about really focusing on Alzheimer's disease and what about all these others? But what's interesting is as you study Alzheimer's and, is it 70%? Is it 60%? Is it 50% of the cause? I don't think we've totally sorted all of that out yet, especially in real world and community based settings. But it's still the big dog, right? It's still the one that's going to be either the majority of the mixed pathology or a good number of the causes of dementia. But as you study that, you learn about everything else. So, I'll give you an example. We have for a long time been doing research in a population that's pretty homogeneous. And so we had a certain set of expectations around screen fail rates. And as now we've moved into more diverse populations, that screen fail rate is really increasing, for example, in the US and communities of color. So why is that? Well, potentially because they have a different mix of the etiology of the disease. And so, one of the diseases that is out there and can really impact people who have lower social determinants of health, and quite honestly, everybody, is vascular dementia, right? And so you think about this wonderful new data that we have around dementias. Notice I said dementias, not Alzheimer's, being preventable. Um, are you actually preventing Alzheimer's pathology, or are you preventing vascular dementia because you're all of a sudden taking care of all these other risk factors? And this is why a differential diagnosis, John, is so important. Because if I just say to someone, you have cognitive impairment and your activities of daily living are impacted, so therefore I'm going to label you in the dementia category, and oh, good luck, set your finances in order. You haven't taken the time to figure out what's causing that. And a good differential, you might find there's things like B12 or geriatric depression or some of these other kinds of things that are very treatable. Sleep apnea, some of the things, managing someone's blood pressure, and all of a sudden you might stabilize, mild cognitive impairment. And so it's really, really important that we take that next step, that we don't, first of all, got to identify the cognitive impairment early. Then you have to do the what's causing it. I don't know another disease state where a doctor wouldn't figure out what's causing it. Once you figure out what's causing it, now we don't just make progress on Alzheimer's disease. We actually can make progress on all of the different pathologies because you're starting to study one and you're having this spillover benefit when somebody's pathology or their progression doesn't match what you expected. Now you have something to go understand. And then I think you make progress on whether that's PSP and the tauopathies because you realize someone has cognitive impairment and they don't have amyloid. So they've got a primary tauopathy. Let's understand that. And it's just the first step on making progress. We have more progress to make on all of it.
Yeah, and it's the backdrop to this, Phyllis. So if I think back to 2013 with the G8 summit here in the UK, led by David Cameron, where we made a very strong commitment to doing something very dramatic about Alzheimer's disease now over 10 years ago. And to be completely honest, there's not really much showed up. So there is something about getting from innovation, the idea we should go do this stuff, mustering people's resources and getting to do it, and then getting people to actually pay attention to issues around early diagnosis, offering support, and ultimately fostering research. What is it you think gets in the way, Phyllis?
You know, I love that you brought up the G8 summit, now the G7. I mean, this was, if you think about what was going on in the world, right, in 2013 when former Prime Minister Cameron had that G8 presidency, uh, it's mind blowing the amount of progress we've made scientifically. But what happened and then we were very successful in, which you mentioned, is we were very successful in getting the multilaterals engaged, right? So we got the World Health Organization engaged in the United Nations, we got OECD, we had the G8, G7, now the G20 engaged. But all of these things were written on communiques. They were written on paper, but nothing was coming off paper and actually making a change at the bedside. Um, that was actually when we went and petitioned the World Economic Forum to create the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. Because when we did some research and we found Gavi and CEPI, these were these very, very large global health initiatives that had been commissioned by the World Economic Forum because it was the one place where the private sector and the public sector could really work together and funds could commingle. So Tedros actually launched and commissioned the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative in January of 2020 before he left to declare the pandemic. And the whole purpose there was to figure out this step from academia and research in laboratory settings and clinical research settings to clinical practice. And we recognized as we were doing some of this work that this last mile, what I call the last mile of health system transformation, is really, really difficult. And, it doesn't matter what disease state you're in, it takes 15 to 20 years for new innovations to make it in the standard of care. When we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, we're talking about a progressive neuropathological disease. Who wants to wait 15 years for that? And so the program was created to tackle exactly the problem that you're talking about. Now, you mentioned the UK. Obviously, I live in the US, which is where, we're sharing Zoom screens today. Um, the world is very different in healthcare context. And one of the things that the US is unique about is that doctors have a lot of autonomy. So they can actually make decisions, for the most part, at least within the conditions of approval, right, in a regulatory condition, without necessarily waiting for a policymaker to make a decision. UK, of course, is very different. And so what that means is in the US, you can go pilot, practice, then policy. Where in the UK and a lot of countries like the UK that have a universal health system, you have to go pilot, policy, then practice. And so what that's allowed us to do is more experimentation here in the US and really understand what are the barriers to implementation? What are the things that we need to break down? And we did our first programs actually globally. We had one in Scotland. We now have some in London as well, and several other places in Europe and Japan and some middle income countries as well as the US. And we're finding a lot of commonality in what the barriers are. The solutions might look a little different, but the barriers are pretty common. And I think that allows us to work just as well as we have globally. Um, on the science side, where we've been super collaborative, we should be just as collaborative on the policy side of basically encouraging the change that needs to happen so this research can actually and the innovation can get out of the research setting and into the clinical setting.
Yeah, thanks very much, Phyllis, and thank you for mentioning Scotland also. And I do always have to remind people outside the UK that Scotland is a very different country to England, different legal system, different educational system. And if I'm completely honest, if I look across the border at the efforts that my old colleagues at Scottish Brain Sciences made, they did a really good job of fostering good relations with third party representatives, advocacy groups, and I think there was much more of a sense in which, to coin a phrase, they could wrap their arms around the people of Scotland to sort of provide that level of dementia care that maybe, sadly, socialized medicine of the sort that we used to hasn't been delivering on. So there are interesting pockets of innovation, and 3 years on, still going. So one assumes that there's a clear opportunity in terms of a business case as well as a case for helping people that ultimately aren't getting the care they need as quickly as they would want. And I share your view completely, Phyllis. I think it's worth saying with as much hyperbole as we can muster. We're now virtually certain, I think, that in most cases, people present with the pathological features of Alzheimer's disease at least 15 years before they show up in clinic and meet our diagnostic criteria. If the clock's ticking that along, I really don't want to be waiting. I want to be one of those guys that gets given something to try to stave off what would otherwise be the inevitable march of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So completely with you. And that early detection, I've been party to lots of discussions. I think you probably would have been party to them yourself. And one of the things that I'm taking away from my 35-year experience in the field, we're still very obsessed with memory, Phyllis. And I get it, because if I go to a public meeting and say, somebody paint me a picture of the typical Alzheimer's disease patient, I'm going to get somebody in the mid 70s, slightly forgetful, sort of a granny or grandfather figure. And I have to say to people, these days in Amsterdam, we diagnose people still working in their mid to late 40s. And I think that trying to shift that picture of what it is to have Alzheimer's disease, if we could shift that a little bit, I think we'd genuinely foster people's understanding. So my concern is, people show up at memory clinics because there's something wrong with their memory. If they got something else wrong with them, which many of the people we see have, problems of paying attention, paying problems, problem solving, trying to engage meaningfully with the world. Are we a little bit too focused on memory, Phyllis? Is there some better work we could do if we kind of cast our net a little more broadly?
Well, I mean, I think measuring cognition writ large is always going to be a challenge, right? If you think about it, it's so much as well a part of your identity, and how it impacts your life, So, I think just in general on the measurement side, um, obviously there's lots of things that we can do, and there's so much exciting work on things that we can do that would identify early signs and symptoms. I think the memory part of this is really tied up in this whole language that we're using around dementia. Memory care, memory centers, memory physicians. If we can really shift to a language of brain health, right? Where we're really talking about, are you taking care of your brain the same way that you're taking care of the other parts of your body that you think about? You mentioned that you're at a time in your life when you're doing a lot of these visits. Well, guess what? When my kids were little, I wasn't taking great care of myself because I was so focused on all the things that were happening with them. And so I remember when the kids started growing up, I started going and doing some of these annual checkups and things that I needed to do. And started finding things. And I was like, oh, why did I go do this? Well, if you can find these things early, I mean, find someone who would prefer that they got a stage 4 cancer diagnosis instead of a stage 1. Find anybody who would prefer that. Nobody, right? And it's exactly the same thing here. And so I think when we start talking about brain health, we're going to start measuring things differently as well. We're going to start noticing things about ourselves earlier. You're going to see that we know the executive function and the frontal temporal lobe is impacted more quickly, right? That's where you're planning and all of those kinds of things. So, how do you measure those? How do you know about those things on yourself? And I'm pretty excited about the ability for technology to do a better job of this. Um, I don't know about you, but if I've had a bad night's sleep, I don't perform as well the next day as I did when I had a good night's sleep. So if I'm doing these standalone pencil and paper tests, they really kind of put boundaries around what can be measured and how it can be measured. And I think both the advent of digital technology now that can be used for cognitive assessment that can capture process metrics as well as, the actual output metrics, but also the ability, think about it for speech or these, devices that we wear, things that can kind of signal to us something's not right. Because the sooner you catch it, the sooner you can do something about it, the more impactful, whether that be therapies or lifestyle change or, anything else that you might be able to catch medication errors or medication, interactions, the faster you can catch those things better. So I'm pretty excited about technology's ability to do a better job measuring brain health for us and putting us in a mindset where we want to take care of our brains before something goes wrong.
Yeah, now music to my ears, Phyllis. Thank you for that. That last line's a beautiful segue to what I want to get into next as well. So thank you for setting that up so neatly. Um, so I one of the things I've heard you and in fairness to a number of our colleagues in the space worry about, complain about, and sometimes sort of rant a little bit about is the lack of equity that we see in the system when it gets to access. And actually, just yesterday, I had a really good example of this. So there's a new client who is going to be sending out phlebotomists, I think, on Harley Davidsons, as far as I can work out, and they're going to be doing remote cognitive assessment. So I think both things you would approve of. But they're going to go to very remote rural areas in an attempt to bring people into the healthcare system with some sense of an early look at their cognition, potentially their blood biomarkers too. So I get the sense that this is happening, but it still feels very piecemeal. I mean, even in the UK, where we should have socialized medicine, but there's the so-called postcode lottery. So depending on where you live, the type and quality of care you get can vary quite substantially, and that's particularly true in the dementia space. So if I think about the most progressive primary healthcare practices in the UK, they're right on the game. I mean, they're measuring beyond memory, they're measuring people over time, they're very mindful of the possible interventions. But there's other places where you're going to show up, you're going to say, my memory's not as good as it used to be, doc, and you're going to be told you're getting old. And that still happens far too often. So I wondered again, I mean, I love the idea of digital technology, but wearing down some of the differences, essentially, sort of trying to bring down some of those big disparities between people based on opportunity. I see the opportunity, and I think probably it's by all means necessary. And I wanted to get your view on this particular issue because whenever I discuss early screening, it tends to be in the context of a single solution. And it seems to me at this point in the game, we've just got to be doing it by any means necessary. So, if people are not doing well on cognitive tests, they should come to our attention. If they're getting to primary healthcare, people are detecting that things are not well, or even if they're starting to make more password errors on their smartphone. Should it be by any means, Phyllis, that this is the way we get people into the funnel efficiently?
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think, in the US, we have the same situation. It's often said that your healthcare is based on your zip code. But what's interesting about that and what I've seen is that's not always a really good assessment of the situation. I happen to live in a very small town in Indiana, outside of Indianapolis. It's a rural farming community, and the primary care doctors here, at least a handful of them, they're doing cognitive assessments at every annual wellness visit. And I'm told that that's not happening in some of the urban areas, at the academic medical centers. And so I'm not sure it's quite as clean um, as rural, urban, or, social determinants impacted, less impacted, et cetera. Um, I do think it's about workflow, and it has to start in primary care. There's no one who goes to a specialist who doesn't think they have a problem, right? You only go to a specialist once you think you have a problem. So if you really want to identify things early, you've got to do so in primary care. And you have to support primary care and frontline physicians, whether those be geriatrics or internist or, family practice, whatever the specialty. You have to support them to do that. And they are covering everything, right? They're covering all the parts of their patient's body. And they may have things that are very, very urgent, whether that be around cardiovascular disease or metabolic, out of control diabetes, things like that. And I think the more we can do to support primary care in being able to do these assessments, doing them regularly so that you can see change, our best comparison is ourselves, right? So you can see change over time. It becomes something regular. I often say, I go in for a sinus infection and somebody slaps a blood pressure cuff on me. I don't need my blood. I have a sinus infection. You don't need to, but there's no stigma around that blood pressure cuff. Well, if we actually did that annual cognitive assessment for everyone, we would also get rid of some of the stigma. And so we've got to enable that. And the thing that makes me nervous is that sometimes we let perfect be the enemy of the good. We have to have the perfect test. We have to have the perfect workflow. We have to have the perfect and the answer is no. We have to do better than what we're doing today, which is nothing. So we have a lot of upside. Um, and we need to do as well as we can to support all the primary care physicians doing that, not just the ones that are, say, in wealthier communities or subsidized by philanthropy or something like that. And we're really a place to do it. I think, John, actually what unlocks early detection is people realizing there's value in early detection. Um, and it used to be, that, well, doctor said, I don't have anything I can do about this. So why would I diagnose? Well, now with the finger studies and worldwide fingers and the replication through the US pointer study, doctors can no longer say there's nothing I can do. There's actually really, really good data on things that we can do. And so I think when you make that connection for a physician, they want to do well. And I think they want to do well even when they're in um, low and middle income countries or low resource settings in high resource countries. Um, I'll give you one little anecdote. When we did our first DAC program in Brazil, was one of our countries. US was one of countries. This is the one Scotland was in. And I think everybody in the US said, "Oh, we're gonna do great." I'm here to tell you, this little tiny town in Brazil ran circles around our sites in the US. And the reason is they thought about this through a public health lens. They were using community health workers. And when you said there's value in early detection, these community health workers said, of course there's value in early detection. We're watching what happens in these families' homes when they don't get a diagnosis. And it was such a different mindset than, say, our Medicare fee for service model that we hear in the US and we have here in the US. And so, I think let's not undervalue how scrappy some of those lower resource settings are. And when they think about brain health as part of a public health agenda, they're willing to move. Do we still need to make sure we have brain health for all? Absolutely. But I think we actually might have more cross sharing between high resource and low resource settings than we allow ourselves to have because the high resource settings sometimes get in their own way.
Thank you for that. Yeah, no, that a great context, Phyllis. Thank you for that. And that premise that we remove stigma by making things literally unremarkable, I've all long subscribed to. It's been very hard to do, and I think boringly, I think almost every area of medicine I've worked in, it's been an issue. Psychiatry, neurology, still that issue around dementia. So that's an idea I'm going to take to the bank. So thank you so much for that one. That's really valuable stuff. And it is an exciting time, Phyllis. I have to remind myself. I can remember seeing you and others at meetings like 5 years ago, and us sitting around talking about diabetes and hypertension pretty much all day, and not really about Alzheimer's disease. And it was time very well spent. But in the last couple of years, I got to say, you go to AIC and the other classic Alzheimer's meetings. There's a proper buzz about the place for me. You finding that too? There's a real upsurge in optimism and interest here.
Yeah, and, for a while, it was just in our conferences, and it was a little bit of a problem because we were in our own echo chamber, right? And all of a sudden, I would go out and I'd be like, "Oh, nobody out there sounds like what we're sounding in here," and we were kind of in our own echo chamber. I'm really excited just within the last year or so that we're starting to hear this enthusiasm now spill out into other parts of our community, whether those be our healthcare providers or, I happen to have turned 50 recently, actually not so recently, a couple of years ago. So I have a lot of friends that are turning 50 and, a lot of the enthusiasm and the excitement for brain health I'm hearing in this community, my peers, whether we're worried about it because we had this in our family or with this real advent of the longevity movement, people are asking questions about brain health very differently than a decade ago or even 5 years ago, even 2 years ago. And so really excited, John, because now it feels like the buzz isn't just the choir preaching to the saved, right? We actually have people starting to say, what do you mean? There's something I can do about this?" And when people realize they have agency over their brain health, this whole conversation shifts. Because now people are gonna force their doctors to have conversations with them. Now they're gonna go do the exploration that they need to do. Now, to be fair, you mentioned the equity piece. It's going to start in, the 50-year-old woman named Elizabeth who eats blueberries and does yoga, right? That's gonna be the first person who picks this thing up. But that's good. That's movement, right? That's moving it out of our echo chamber and into people really saying, "Oh, there's something I can do? Alzheimer's isn't just gonna come get me, and there's nothing I can do." And the answer is, yeah, you have agency over your own brain health. And then all of a sudden, some of the pieces start clicking together. This idea of the pathology starts 10 to 20 years before symptoms. You need to be doing something in your 40s and 50s, right? Let's have conversations about our brain health with our friends, with our church groups, with our book clubs, and certainly with our doctors. And I think that's where the excitement really starts happening. And I know the scientists that we work with, that's what they want. None of these researchers want to work on innovation that's never going to get to a patient. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, no, completely. And then thank you. That picture of a scientist at a bar in a hotel talking to me in such earnest terms, Phyllis, I mean, gosh, I vaguely remember being 50s, so bless you for getting there. But um, I now sort of meet early career researchers typically after a presentation or a general area after an event, and it's remarkable how earnest and how keen and a level of enthusiasm that I think I used to have and maybe has deserted me a little bit recently. So fostering that, completely agree. And there does seem to be a very ambitious, hungry new generation of early career researchers coming through. So anything we can do to turn those guys on as well. And I love that brain health premise as well. I mean, can I tell me just to say a little bit more about that? Because it comes in a lots of guises. I think I know what I mean by it, but a brain health centered healthcare, what would that look like for you, Phyllis?
Well, I think we've made progress. I mean, typically brain health is seen as both cognitive health and mental health or behavioral health. And we've made a lot of progress actually on depression and mental health, reducing the stigma,
Mm,
the, the NFL, which is, the US version of football. We have a Kick the Stigma campaign that's during the NFL season. And so there's a lot of progress there. We haven't made nearly as much progress on cognitive health. And I think, I often say to people, this is the most important thing about us. This is the most important thing about us. And when was the last time that you went to the doctor and the doctor said, let's do an assessment of your brain health, right? And I think part of it is what you asked earlier. It's really hard to measure. It's really hard to kind of say writ large, how's your brain health? But we have the tools now. They're available to us. Are they perfect? No. Are they going to get better? Yes. Are they way better than what we're doing today? Absolutely. Let's start using them. But I just think having this conversation about not just depression and anxiety and some of the things that are currently in the health screeners, but also starting, I'd like to start at 50. My preference, John, is that we would start this at 50. I think in most countries, it's going to be where their social security system starts. So for us in the US, our Medicare system is at age 65. But if we could even have everybody at age 65 have some sort of cognitive assessment in their annual wellness visit, which, by the way, That is actually mandated by law that every Medicare beneficiary in the United States has the right to a cognitive assessment at their annual wellness visit. It's in law. It's done. Less than 10% of patients get that experience. So once again, if we just did that, then all of a sudden we would normalize this conversation. And once again, you get your own baseline and you know when things change. And when things start changing, then the doctor says something's different. What's happened? You know, and by the way, it might be depression, right? And it might be something that's very reversible, or it might be a medication, or it might be, um, some other kind of part of your life, your blood pressure or your sleep or weight gain or something else that has caused your cognitive status to change. And boy, the faster you catch that, the faster you can do something about it. And I just think that we've got a population now, the baby boomers, that are going to want something different in their lives. They've worked hard and they want to have as much time in front of them. They want their brain span to be as long as their lifespan. So for me, Brain Health puts both of those things together. I think we've made more progress on mental health than we have on cognitive health, but it's right here. It's right in front of us, and we've got the tools to do it. We just need to get out of our own way and make it easier to do so.
Yeah, no, no, thank you, Phyllis, and that puts it nicely. And I do like that shift to brain health. It's a lot easier to get people to come and sit in a cold village hall to listen to a brain health presentation than an Alzheimer's disease one. So I think we're doing ourselves a real favor by trying to speak to that early end. Let's protect you while you've still got a good, healthy brain, and we can maybe even fend off these ravages.
Yeah,
So
please don't call it a dementia presentation because you'll get a
no.
completely different response.
No, that can be very unhelpful, can't it? I wanted to ask you also, Phyllis. So, in the context of precipitating events, you talked eloquently about finger pointer, all the studies where we've looked at multiple impacts, and as a consequence of that, modifiable factors as well. One area where I think we maybe don't get as much discussion as I would like, and I know that this is a topic for you historically, are issues around reproductive health and fundamental differences between men and women. Coming from the other side of that genetic divide, where unfortunately, much of the statistics and the numbers that I draw from are on people like me. That's not always the case, I know, for the gals in our field. So, what can we do to move the dial on that a little, Phyllis? What would you like to see people putting money in and investing in?
Yeah, I love that you bring up the topic of women and gender. I think for a long time we've seen women have more cases of dementia and Alzheimer's than men, and it was always kind of associated with the fact that women tend to live longer, and obviously age is the greatest risk factor. But what we're learning now, because we have the ability to do some precision measurement, whether that be of cognitive domains or biomarkers, is we're learning something that we've known in other disease states. Women's Women aren't just little men. Women's brains are not just little men's brains, right? And it's not so much the clinical trial participation as you've seen in some other therapeutic areas, cardiovascular disease and things. We actually are pretty good in terms of the percentage of women that enroll in Alzheimer's clinical trials, but we haven't collected the data that we need because most Alzheimer's studies are done in women that are postmenopausal. So and almost they have to be postmenopausal. We don't actually collect some of the medical history that would be incredibly informative about their cognitive health. So for example, age of onset of menses, age of onset of menopause. Did you use hormone replacement therapy? How close to your age of menopause onset did you start hormone replacement therapy? These are things that have nuances that we haven't been collecting necessarily in our medical claims or in our medical history when we do clinical trial. So we did a lot of research back when I was at Lilly on kind of trying to separate our data by gender and understand where there are different impacts. And we actually couldn't see much, but we didn't have the data we needed to see it. We hadn't collected some of that medical information. I think also when it comes to cognitive assessments, once again, your sweet spot, I'm going to say things that you're the expert on, which is kind of scary. So you're going to have to fix it when I say it wrong. But, we know I'm a mom of boys. I'm here to tell you, boys' brains and girls' brains are different. I can tell you from my N of 2. And, we but because of that, the way we measure cognitive change could be different, right? Some of the cognitive assessments that we use, maybe if they focus quite a bit, for example, on visuospatial, which from a gender bias perspective, it has a male leaning, set of capabilities. If we talk about the speech and verbal acuity, changes, right? And once again, mom of boys, I can tell you verbal acuity for girls is different than boys, right? And so, these are the types of things that I think we haven't gotten exactly right, and that we could be doing a lot more research on. And it would show us how progression is different by gender. It would show us how the pathology is different by genders. There's some great work that Rachel Buckley has done on imaging. Um, and looking at tau and how tau impacts female brains versus male brains. We have things that we can do that we never could do before. And I would love to see us put more thought in that, not because I think it's more important to study women than men. But when you study women, you learn more about men too, right? It's the same conversation we had about the different dementias. When you learn more about one, it helps you learn about the other. And I think it's just going to get us better at treating this disease across the whole population.
Yeah, no, thanks, Phyllis, and I appreciate that because certainly it's a job of work for us in psychology with the cognitive assessments, and I'm very blessed. I think every profession I've worked in has been a majority women, and that's certainly true of psychology. So there's a lot of people pulling hard weight on this for us and making sure that we do map it. And it can be trivial. I mean, I had an example just last week. The idea that we might correct test performance according to sex, years of education, and age. It's pretty basic in clinic. It's the kind of thing you do all the time. But oddly, in clinical trials, it's exotic and still is. So I think we do have to do a lot more of learning from that very well understood space into the trial space, which I would judge, and I think others would judge, there's room for improvement when it comes to cognition and an understanding of people coming into our trials. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Phyllis. And it leads me quite nicely to the next issue I wanted to raise with you. And it's really about we've made extraordinary progress, and I completely agree. That coalition of the willing has come up with blood biomarkers, innovative new technologies, neuroimaging sequences. I mean, it's been breathtaking to see science being applied as quickly and as rapidly, and with such extraordinary breakthroughs as we've witnessed in just the last few years. And I wondered, is it in any sense in your mind, are we creating with Alzheimer's disease a template for how we might start to address other neurodegenerative diseases? Does this provide us with at least the architecture for understanding how we need to do early detection, early intervention with other forms of dementia?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would even say within Alzheimer's disease, different mechanisms. So, there's definitely a feeling that we've spent a lot of time on and in resource and amyloid. And we have, but one of the reasons we have was we could measure it. Right? And so the thing about trying to develop a therapy is you need to be able to know that you have a druggable target, you can measure that you've reached the target, and you can measure response to therapy on that target. And the brain has been the last frontier. I mean, I don't know about you, not too many people are volunteering for brain biopsy when they're living, right? So we had to wait, right, until people had passed away and done brain donation. And that's where the advent of PET became just transformative for our field. Now, blood, but we're still really looking at amyloid. And so, amyloid and tau, we know, are those pathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. But, you've got different types of tauopathies. You may have different types of mechanisms that could move amyloid and tau. Neuroinflammation is one that I'm really excited about. And we don't have great ways of measuring all of those things yet. We don't have the biomarkers that we need to be able to say, is it hitting the drug? Is the drug hitting the target? Is there a response to therapy? That's what gets studies funded. And so, I see that as we move through amyloid, and then we get to tau. Now we've got a group of people that are working on neuroinflammation biomarkers. We're looking at people are looking at primary tauopathy markers versus kind of Alzheimer's tau markers, right? And this gets really exciting because I think we're where cancer was in, say, the mid 90s, where you had one mechanism, the cytotoxins, everybody got general chemo. And think about where we are now, right? You get your tumor typed, you have a precision therapy, that's and look at and the number of approvals that have come from the FDA since like 1994 or so when we were getting a couple of approvals a year in oncology. I think that's where we are in Alzheimer's. And I just want to make sure that we recognize we're at that point of the S curve. And as a field, as funders, we have the opportunity to put the pedal to the metal right now. And that is gonna move the needle on Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, all your neurodegenerative disease, as well as the different types of mechanisms underneath it. And I think it's just a really, really exciting time for the field and a really exciting time to be a researcher. We need those dollars coming in.
Yeah. Great, and thank you again. It's a perfect segue, Phyllis. So, one of the things that we flatter ourselves with this podcast is that we get a few people tuning in. It's been a joy that I thought that the original number we were aiming for was fairly modest. We massively exceeded what we would have thought we were going to get in terms of a viewership and a listenership, and that's been hugely rewarding. And I think we probably got to the point where we flatter ourselves that maybe some quite important people now tune in to get a little update on the Alzheimer's field. So, on the presumption that those people are listening to us now, Phyllis, is there one area of policy that if you could wave a magic wand and throw a little bit more money and sprinkle at, would be the one you'd shoot with?
I think I'm going to ask for license to have two. Um, and one I mentioned already, and that is if we could wave the magic wand and say, let's get everyone over the age of 55, 60, 65, pick your age, everyone gets an annual cognitive assessment. And we do early detection in a systematic way. It really unlocks everything. It unlocks conversations about brain health. It unlocks better care for patients and their families. We're talking about people who are dealing with cognitive impairment at home by themselves. Why are we letting that happen? Right. And then my second wave, it unlocks research. So, you probably follow Jeff Cummings' pipeline report like we all do each year. We have an incredible number of molecules, and just many new mechanisms. I think there's something like 140 new molecules in the pipeline. And if you look at it, we need 50,000 participants a year to adjudicate that research. Right now, we're enrolling about 12,000 participants. Do you know what that means? That means those therapies won't get to patients fast enough. And that doesn't mean that every single one of those drugs is gonna work, but the faster we do the research, the faster we get the answers. And so the other policy one that I would ask for is, let's give people paid time off to participate in clinical trials. Give them paid time off to donate blood, to do jury duty, to bone marrow donation or organ donation. They get paid time off. Let's give them paid time off to participate in a clinical trial. It's one of the most selfless things that someone can do for the world. And I would love to see policymakers encourage that. I think more people would think about enrolling in a clinical trial. I think you'd get more diversity in clinical trials and more representation. And so those are two things I'd ask for. Let's do systematic early detection and let's get these clinical trials enrolled by making it easy for people to participate where they don't have to make trade-off from their work days. And I think we'd see that innovation curve come at us a lot faster.
Yeah, I feel it. I mean, I'm more than happy to let you have two. While you're on it, if you've got three actually, because those two were pretty good ones to start with. And
I do want a third. You want my third?
honestly, well, yeah, keep it coming because I mean, unpaid time off. I mean, it feels like I don't know. Not that I've sat with politicians very often, but when I have, and I've sort of said, I think I've got a quick win for you, and it's not going to break the bank. And it sounds like to me, like you've just suggested, paid time off. It starts to equal the playing field a little bit more, gives people more opportunity.
Absolutely.
No,
Well, and you
completely.
take out, for those, if you do have policymakers on here, one of the biggest concerns about clinical trials is remuneration of people for their time, right? Well, everyone has a different value of their time. So, how do you pick the dollar value that the IRB will allow you to pay a participant for their time? You pick too low a number, and it's not people don't feel like their time is valued. You pick too high a number, and you've created an incentive that doesn't make sense from an ethical review board. You do paid time off, you neutralize that, and everybody's time is valued as to what their time is value for them. And so I think that's a good one. And if I got a third one, it would let's invest in these biomarkers. It is not got a capital market that is investable the same way therapeutics are, which is why the ADDF started DXA 3.0, but it's not big enough and we don't have enough of it. And these biomarkers are our enabling technologies that allow the research to be done and allow the therapeutic studies to be funded. So I'd like to see more investment in new biomarker research too. But those would be my 3 legs of the stool. Early detection, clinical trials, and let's get this funding in for biomarkers.
Nice. The classic 3 wishes. I feel like a fairy godmother, Phyllis. It's quite a moment, let me tell you. Phyllis, I'm just looking at my clock here, and it's telling me that we've been chatting for an hour, which it always astonishes me to find that an hour passes quite so quickly in your comfort. So, thank you so much. And lots of topics of conversation, and it's always incredibly valuable to have your personal take as well as the public and policy take that I know sometimes you're forced to adopt. So Phyllis, thank you so much for your time today. You've been incredibly generous. It's just one more thing is for me to ask you. What's the one thing about you which you have most optimism? Maybe not just in the Alzheimer's space, but across neurodegenerative disease more generally.
Well, I think we've hit it. This is the time. This is the time. I do this because I didn't work fast enough for my daddy. And I want to be fast enough for my kids. And it's here. This is the time. We have everything in front of us so that our kids are not going to have to care for us the way that we cared for our parents and our parents cared for our grandparents, and our kids are not going to get these diseases. And so it's right here. I have more hope for where we are scientifically and clinically than I ever have. This is the time to be in this space, and this is the time to just double down and go after it.
Phyllis, thank you for such a thoughtful and forward looking discussion. And what strikes me most is the reminder that while innovation in Alzheimer's research is accelerating at an extraordinary pace, meaningful progress also depends on building the policies, systems, and clinical infrastructure that allow those innovations to reach the people that need them. It's clear that there are practical steps we can take today while continuing to push the science forward. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We hope this conversation has provided new perspectives on the importance of early detection, equitable care, and the collective effort required to improve brain health across communities. Thanks for joining us today. Join us for our next episode when I'll be speaking with Dr. Maria C. Carrillo, Chief Science Officer and Medical Affairs Lead at the Alzheimer's Association, about the evolving role of awareness and advocacy in advancing research, reducing stigma, and accelerating progress across neurodegenerative diseases.